What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome to another edition of America Trends. I'm Larry Rifkin, and my producer John Krofsik is here. And John and I became well aware of this issue of trade. Now, John, I know you're a big baseball fan, and you're thinking of the Red Sox, trading the Babe to the Yankees many years ago, and the curse of the Bambino. But we're not talking about that kind of trade. How did we get so deeply immersed in caring about trade, you and I, because we've got no background in international finance?
Well, I think we see, though, even right here in Connecticut, all the jobs that have been lost to, foreign countries, and I think that's how we got here.
Well, even this week, if you watch 60 Minutes, you saw an incredible piece on these H-1B visas. And a lot of people in Connecticut have told me that it was only insult added to injury when they actually had to not only hear that they were losing their job to somebody from overseas, but that they had to train that individual to actually do their job.
I know. That's horrible. Tough. Yes, I agree. I mean, I caught a part of that. I got to catch the rest of it when I get home, but incredible. I mean, to train somebody for a lower price than to lose your job. I mean,
but this stuff has been going on for a very, very long time. And I will tell you, if you remember, but you weren't really with me at this point, though you've always been kind of with me and working on the broadcast side since I came back into radio. But years back, John, there was a book written by our next guest that came to my attention, and it really shocked me. Because I'm talking about 2002. Now, we're talking to our audience today, 2017. So we're talking about 15 years ago. And this guy was prescient. He wrote a book called The Race to the Bottom. And so it was the title that got my interest. Are we really at bottom? And, of course, that was after 9/11, and America was in the doldrums and such. But nonetheless, he was talking about this trade issue back then. And I didn't know anything about it. But I started talking to him on the radio all the time, and I really got filled up. And you know him now. You have been party to what we've been doing for the last several years, and he's pretty remarkable, isn't he?
Oh, he's very remarkable. Unbelievable. I wish somebody else would listen to him because he's got a lot of really good ideas for getting us out of this mess we're in, and I don't know. We just seem to be spinning our wheels.
Well, for the longest time, Alan and I would have these conversations, and I didn't know whether our audience, John, really had any interest in this, whether they really understood it, whether the implications were clear. But yet we live and we broadcast from a city that has been decimated by industrial decline. All around us, these hulking masses of buildings that are left to rot and to become fire hazards and to really keep us from being able to actually build our way to a new future because they're so damn costly even to get rid of them with all their pollution and all their environmental concerns. So we live in a city that is really emblematic of those states this year, like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio and others, that brought this election forward to Donald Trump.
You're absolutely right. Yeah, they kind of they call it the Rust Belt states because there ain't nothing going on.
But we're here on the East Coast,
yep.
And we're one of the Rust Belt states.
We are.
We really are.
Yep.
So, but Alan Tonelson is absolutely remarkable. Even when nobody else was talking about this, Alan understood the implications. Well, John, way back, he worked for the U.S. Business and Industry Council, and I looked up that organization, and that was an organization that represented not the big guys, not the guys who were sending all these jobs overseas, but small manufacturers who saw what was going on and the fact that they were part of a supply chain that no longer really needed them because they had cheaper ways to import this stuff back into the country.
Incredible.
Well, he's just a wonderful man. His name is Alan Tonelson, and he's been watching this issue on our behalf for many years. We're all starting to pay attention now, and I've got to say this, in all fairness, it took Donald Trump deciding to make this a key issue of his campaign to actually awaken the American public to the consequences of continuing these current practices and signing on to more of these trade deals that look like the previous trade deals. And, John, we'll get into it with Alan. But one of the things I kept asking him every time I'd have him on, why do we keep doing this? I mean, if what we're seeing are these empty buildings and lives full of despair and communities decimated, why do we continue to sign on to this if we can see that this is destroying communities?
Well, that's a good question. I hope he can finally answer that. But, the other thing is, can we get Washington? I mean, since Donald Trump's been elected, we're at a standstill on everything. Nothing is moving.
Well, he is taking some credit for using the bully pulpit to get better pricing from Boeing and to get certain people. Well, I just saw an ad, John. I mean, you look at it. There are people who are saying, hey, I get this America First thing. Pratt Manufacturing, American jobs. Congratulations and thanks to everyone on the Pratt team on today's opening of our 68th factory, a $60 million box plant in Beloit, Wisconsin. Oh. And thanks to all of our customers and local, state, and federal governments for making America the world's greatest manufacturing environment. We at Pratt Industries are fully committed to the Trump administration's vision of creating manufacturing jobs in America. Our company has invested $2.5 billion to employ 7,000 Americans in well-paying manufacturing jobs. So there is something to this where he is meeting with business leaders and he's saying, I'm going to give you some favorable tax policies.
Right.
And better trade deals, but I want you to come along with me. Now, don't forget, some of the big guys that he's talking to are the same guys who wanted to be able to outsource these jobs. So, I don't know. He's got a lot of work to do to convince them to stay here.
Boy, you're not kidding.
Well, let's talk to Alan.
All right,
let's get him on the show.
All right, sounds good.
Well, Alan, I gave you a big build-up. John and I were talking about trade. And, for him, trade was, the big bambino going to the Yankees. I mean, he didn't know anything about trade before we started conversing with you. And I get a lot about all of this related to trade because you have schooled me over many years. You and I used to talk about this issue really in a vacuum when nobody else was talking about it.
Completely.
And you wrote that book in 2002, The Race to the Bottom. I mean, when did you begin to see these telltale signs?
Well, I can certainly agree with you that it was lonely out there on that branch for a long, long time. And it's nice to have company, although, of course, when you're way out on a limb, literally speaking, I'm not sure how much company you want, but if you look at it more figuratively, there's no doubt that criticisms of U.S. trade policy have become a lot more numerous and a lot more powerful and coming from a lot more different quarters, including, of course, the new president of the United States, which really counts for a lot. How did I first get wind of real trouble?
Well, the trend
area?
that you saw way back when, that these deals just were not benefiting the majority of Americans.
It really went back to the early 1990s, and in part, it was the legacy of pre-1990s trade policy before it entered what I call this offshoring phase, which it's still in, which unfortunately it's still in, President Trump's election notwithstanding, because while he's held the line, let's say in terms of not going forward with the Trans-Pacific Partnership plans that President Obama had, we haven't seen much rollback, and of course he's only been in office less than 2 months, so we have to have realistic expectations. But that being said, as a result, we're still in that offshoring phase of trade policy, by which I mean the aim of trade policy used to be, at least the stated purpose, used to be we're going to try to pry open markets overseas that are too closed presently to exports of U.S. goods and U.S. services, and in so doing, we're going to create more growth for the American economy, and we're going to create more jobs. Now, that actually remained the stated purpose of U.S. trade policy after about 1990, but at the very least, an important big new wrinkle was introduced, and at the same time, the public was never told about it, and that wrinkle was that the purpose of trade policy also became to help U.S. multinational companies offshore production and offshore jobs. And the purpose, of course, was to enable them to supply a U.S. market, that is U.S. customers, who were still very wealthy, whether they were individuals or businesses, from foreign production sites that were much cheaper to set up factories in and to set up operations in than were sites in the United States. So what a great deal. You could supply this very high cost, or I should say this very high price, wealthy U.S. market, but you could do it from much lower cost, mainly third world production sites, like first Mexico, where trade was expanded greatly with the North American Free Trade Agreement, and then mainly with China, although those were not the only two third world countries with which the United States tried to and actually succeeded in greatly expanding trade.
When you look at the surplus, and when I talk about surplus, I'm talking about a surplus of empty factories, broken communities, and tales of personal despair that end up in diseases of despair, which we've seen in the Rust Belt, and we've talked about the opioid crisis on this podcast. Why did it take so long for the American public to catch on to what's been going on?
There are so many reasons. The first one that I could cite off the top of my head is when you've got the entire American establishment, the political establishment, the business establishment, the media establishment, including, of course, the President of the United States, when you've got all of the major figures in those establishments beating the drums every single day over and over again that these trade deals are either great now, or if they're not looking great now, they're certainly going to be great just a little ways down the road. It's very difficult for individuals to figure out why they should be skeptical. After all, don't these people know what they're doing?
Okay, so we gave them the benefit of the doubt. Why did no other politician? I mean, look at the way that Donald Trump was able to take an issue that you and I couldn't make sexy for many, many years and made it sexy.
First, the offshoring interests, especially in the American business community, were very generous in funding the campaigns of politicians running for House seats, running for Senate seats, and running for the White House. And they were very generous with Democrats, and they were very generous with Republicans also. So their role in financing campaigns was absolutely critical. And then second, in the 1990s and into the 2000s, the U.S. economy experienced what a lot of folks in the economics world are now recognizing as bubbleization. The powers that be figured out a way to preserve the illusion of prosperity for the middle and working classes without bringing a halt to the trade policies that were draining them of real wealth. And to make a long story short, they were able to accomplish this goal by providing working class and middle class families with oceans of cheap credit that they used to prop up their living standards artificially in ways that their wages and their incomes, which were sagging at best, couldn't possibly achieve.
Interesting. Now, I want to go back and do a primer, if you would do this with me, because I think there are people listening to America Trends, and you're listening to the very well-informed voice of Alan Tonelson, who don't even understand what trade is. So if we did a primer 101, If companies want to exchange goods, I mean, what is the role of the state in that historically?
Historically, the state has not had a very great role in what you might call supervising trade, because trade did take place overwhelmingly among private sector economic actors, whether they were companies or families or individuals, and since this international trade mainly took place among high-income countries, although there was some role for finance, obviously there was a role for providing credit and for providing assurances that payments would actually be made by folks who might have lived across the ocean from you. Even that was largely private sector, and for the most part, those governments that were actively trading stayed out of this picture. This began to change largely in the early 20th century.
Really, that late?
I really think. I mean, there's no doubt that certain countries have long adopted, or at least had previously adopted, a strategy of trade protection, which economists also call mercantilism, which involved closing their markets to varying degrees to foreign goods, thinking that that was the best route to prosperity. But certainly by the late 19th and very early 20th centuries, largely because a largely free trading Great Britain was so powerful around the world economically, the free trade model really took hold to an extent that it never had before. And yet, as I'm sure most of our listeners know, by the 1920s certainly, and into the 1930s, the global economy experienced absolutely horrible times. The deepest and widest spread depression in economic activity that had been seen certainly within living memory, and as a result, largely as a result, nations began to re-erect trade barriers once again, and it really wasn't until the aftermath of World War II when the victorious Allied governments generally came to the conclusion that these trade barriers turned out to be a major source of not only economic conflict, but the kinds of global tensions that led to the rise of fascist governments in places like Japan and also Germany. It was not until the late 1940s that the victorious Allied governments concluded that erecting these trade barriers was a huge mistake that must never be repeated again, and governments all over the world, obviously to varying degrees, got into the business of taking trade barriers down.
All right, and getting involved in the game. But here's a question that I think a lot of people might have on their minds, and yet we're so ill-informed about this issue often that we don't even want to raise it. Mm-hmm. But if there is a trade deficit, as we now have had for decades, does the government owe somebody money, or is it the consumer who's buying the products from elsewhere? What does a deficit really mean?
It means that we as a nation, and mainly it means the private sector, is consuming much more than it's actually producing, and it's certainly buying from overseas much more than it's selling to overseas customers. Now, that, of course, is only possible if someone or something is providing credit. And in recent years, in fact, going back much further than that, this credit has been provided by varying combinations of the U.S. government, because clearly the U.S. government, the federal government, got into the habit of spending much more than it was taking in terms of tax revenue, but also because the private sector was in such deep and chronic deficit too. Foreign governments, by definition, and this gets us into the rather wonky mathematics of trade, foreign governments needed to provide that credit, or else the U.S. private sector could not continue living beyond its means.
Okay, so let me get into this, because this brings us to a point where you run into conflict, you, Alan Tonelson, with, say, the Wall Street Journal. And they say that when you have a trade deficit, and they said this in a recent editorial, or a current account deficit, right, that's good, because it means that we're a healthy economy that can buy things. And that balance is achieved by having a capital account surplus, and that the dollars that we're sending to China and Mexico come back in assets like real estate, stocks, debt, or dollar accounts. So what's wrong with their logic?
There's nothing intrinsically wrong with their logic, and if the world worked the way that economics textbooks tell us that it works, that would be true. But what the economic textbooks miss is that the various countries of the world that comprise the world trading system are structured. They've chosen to structure their economies in very different ways. They have set very different economic and, as a result, social they've set very different economic priorities, largely because their larger societies and larger cultures have developed often in very different ways too, and we just know this from knowing anything about world history. Different countries have developed different cultures, different societies, because they're located often in very different places. They're of often dramatically different sizes. They've had dramatically different historical experiences, and therefore what they look like, how they choose to run their affairs, and how they choose to organize their societies and their economies are understandably quite different also. And those differences, those social differences, those cultural differences, have tended to produce comparably great differences in their economic structures. And the problem is that some countries, like ours, have chosen, for, again, various reasons, to orient their national economic models around spending, around encouraging spending. That's not all that we do, but but there's a very pronounced focus on making it relatively easy for businesses and for consumers to spend, and also, largely as a result, for businesses and for consumers to buy goods and services from overseas.
But in the past, we used to think about made in the USA. Mm-hmm. We thought that was an imprimatur that suggested quality, durability, and that this was the heart of the American experience, that we could get a good job in a manufacturing plant and we could support our family. We're here in a city that used to be the brass capital of the world.
Right.
And it supported a number of radio stations and a number of haberdashers and a number of hairdressers, and all of that is affected by the industrial mass that you have in a community. When did we stop thinking that was imperative for our economic success?
That's a great point, Larry. And in fact, it's also very important to observe the financial side of that, which is that for most of their history, Americans have been great savers. This focus on encouraging consumption, which only partly is the product of government policy. I mean, we also have to recognize all of the cultural forces and all the social forces that have turned us into such an avid consumer society. But having said that, that model, that consumption-focused model, really didn't begin to take hold until the years after World War II, largely because, I think, the U.S. economy was so predominant in the global economy because so much of the rest of the world was literally leveled by war. There was literally nothing to compete with this country, that wealth creation seemed to be relatively effortless. And so we started thinking a lot less about how do you create wealth, how do you actually produce things, and how do you make sure you can keep performing those tasks at world-class levels. And we thought more about, how should we enjoy this tremendous windfall, which is really what it was, this tremendous windfall that we're experiencing.
So we had the world to ourselves as a producer of so many goods because we were the one left standing. Our land was not disrupted as many European countries. So did we squander that lead and that legacy?
In large part we did, although I think there is one very prominent exception, and that is the U.S. government became very active in promoting technological innovation. Now, it became very active in promoting technological innovation largely because Washington recognized that was a major key to continued U.S. military predominance and therefore national security. And yet, what happened over and over again, and this was not intended, but it was a clear result, was that so many of the technologies that were fostered by federally sponsored research and development turned out to have tremendous non-military spin-offs. And in fact, it's really no exaggeration to say that there would be no American information technology industry that at least we would recognize today of the scale that it's reached without very substantial federal investment in semiconductors, in software, for mainly military purposes, to make sure we had the best and most advanced weapons on this planet. And that worked very well, but again, the spin-off effects, which were largely unforeseen, were nothing less than spectacular. And as the federal government continued down this road, the spin-offs became so apparent that their value was actually recognized.
So let's go to where the debate that we're having today and the changes that we envision today really emanate from. And that's from trade deals that have been made in the last 30 years or so. And, of course, NAFTA being the most prominent of them. And were these deals totally different than deals that we had had in the past? Or was it just that, as you say, there were just so many inequities in terms of the pay scale of those in Mexico or the environmental standards? What was it about these deals that have made them rather unproductive for the United States?
They were dramatically different in large part because the targets of U.S. trade policy, the targets of U.S. trade liberalization, starting with NAFTA, starting with Mexico, were overwhelmingly very low-income countries, and that was very different from the trade policies that preceded deals like NAFTA, which almost needed to focus on much higher-income countries where consumers, at least in principle, could actually afford to buy what Americans made. Now, at the same time, and I keep using phrases like at the same time, because there are so many variables moving in so many very important ways. But there was also very important continuity in U.S. trade policy. Before 1990, which is when I think you can actually date the start of this current offshoring era of U.S. trade policy, and the pre-1990 trade policies. And the element of continuity was that the United States continued to trade with countries whose economic structures were fundamentally different. In the case of the higher income countries that dominated U.S. trade before 1990, we're talking about countries typified by Japan and and Germany, which gave us by far the greatest trade problems we had back then, countries whose national business models were not focused on fostering consumption, on making it easy for their households to keep buying stuff, and that tried to make it easy for both consumers and their own businesses to buy foreign goods and foreign services. These countries took largely the opposite tack. They conducted policies that fairly, I think, and accurately can be called protectionist. They didn't believe in the virtues of free trade. They didn't believe in the virtues of economies that were largely open to foreign competition. They strongly believed that the road to prosperity was explicitly championing their own industries, being very happy to capitalize on the openness of the U.S. market, but not allowing U.S. companies and U.S. workers to capitalize on opportunities to sell to their own consumers. And they also adopted a strategy of keeping consumption down. Again, fostering consumption of any kind was just not an aim that they adopted. Quite the opposite. They felt that there was absolutely no chance that they could consume their way to continuing prosperity. They were confident that saving and investing and producing were the best guarantees they would have of not only continuing prosperity, but ever greater prosperity.
There's a very interesting concept in the Wall Street Journal, Monday, March 20th, 2017. Trade policy must spar with gravity. And they were talking about how important it is to have proximity in many cases to your trading partners. But when you look at the U.S. and our top trading partners, we're looking at Canada, number one, China, number two,
right,
Mexico, three, and Japan and Germany. How does that list align for you?
Well, that list really tells me that proximity these days says little about where the greatest trade flows are going to actually emerge. And that's not to say that geography is completely unimportant. For example, one reason that North America basically isn't even more dominant in the U.S. trade picture than it is because the economies of Canada and Mexico, our two North American neighbors, are relatively small. It's almost universally forgotten, if it was ever known to start with, that if you add up the economies of all three North American countries that, of course, comprise that NAFTA trade area, the United States represents 87% of that market. There's very little left.
Absolutely. The difference between bilateral and multilateral agreements, put that in perspective for us historically.
You know, it's funny in that I must say that until the Trump administration came into office, and of course the Trump administration has made a great deal of what it sees as major differences between bilateral and so-called multilateral trade agreements, I just never thought about it that much, because as I saw it, one main reason that U.S. trade policy was so ineffective was that whatever type of trade agreement we signed, we never used the overwhelming leverage that we had by virtue of the sheer size of our economy. We never used anything like that leverage in any trading arrangements to make sure that legitimate American interests were actually adequately defended. And that was true for bilateral trade agreements, like various relatively small-scale trade agreements we signed with, for example, Japan, starting in the late 1980s, extending into the early 1990s, to try to open up very specific sectors of the Japanese economy. Clearly, the U.S. held the whip hand when it came to that relationship, and yet that overwhelming power and leverage was never used, and so Japanese Japanese trade barriers stood as tall at the end of those various negotiations as they did at the start. When we're talking about multilateral trade agreements, I think what the Trump administration is focusing on are problems it sees with U.S. membership in the World Trade Organization, which is a global trade body made up of virtually every economy in the global economy that seeks to create and to enforce rules that can supervise global trade, and also various shortcomings that it saw in the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was begun under President George W. Bush, and where the actual negotiations, though, were not completed until the last year or two of President Obama's administration. And the Trump critique seems to be that when we sign trade agreements with large groups of countries, or when we enter into trade arrangements with the entire world, as is the case with the World Trade Organization, that inevitably waters down U.S. power and U.S. influence. Now, they're right they're right as far as they go, but I don't think that they go far enough, because there's no doubt, certainly in my mind, that in whatever trade arrangement the United States gets itself into, it's always going to have the lion's share of that leverage, because its market, access to its market, which is the largest single national market in the world and the most open by far, access to that market is always the main prize of any trade negotiation.
Absolutely, and you wrote a really...
or multilateral, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, you wrote a compelling op-ed in the New York Times about this very recently. So let's dig into where we're going. We're now turning the corner. I wanted to make certain that people had a basic understanding. So here we are today. What is that leverage, and how much do we need to use it, and use it much more aggressively in any of the deals that we put forward in the future, and recognizing the strength of this market for consumers? Explain how powerful that is.
Well, it was extremely powerful even when the world economy was much healthier and growing much faster than it is now, precisely because virtually every other major trading power depended for so much of its growth on amassing trade surpluses. That is to say, exporting to the rest of the world much more than it actually bought from the rest of the world. And the greatest single national target by far of everybody else's exports was the U.S. economy. And this situation, actually, by the late 1990s, became so noticeable and so alarming to even Bill Clinton's administration that at one point one of his leading economic aides, Larry Summers, said, we're like... He said the world is in the same situation as a 4-engine airplane that's only flying on one engine. And that one engine is this wide-open U.S. economy, and that's obviously a very dangerous situation to be in, because if that engine sputters, everybody's sunk.
Okay, so can these countries look at the last couple of decades and say, gee, we got away with one. We really were hosing the United States, and now they've caught up to this game, and we need them so desperately. The American consumer is such a prize that we have got to yield to whatever their concerns are.
Well, I think that there's no question that the rest of the world has enjoyed the global trade status quo that's emerged over the last roughly 20 years immensely, and have found it tremendously advantageous, and that's why you've heard such loud complaints about whatever statements Trump administration officials have made to the effect that things must change, that this status quo is actually not satisfactory to us. and that we are going to use this enormous leverage that we have to create more equitable terms of trade for the American economy. One point, though, that I wish that the Trump administration was making more strongly and more explicitly is that more equitable global trading arrangements and more balanced global trade is also good for the entire world economy, because when trade flows get too lopsided, they tend to produce financial crises of the type that struck in 2008, which hurt everybody all over the world. So if we want to try, if we simply want to try to avoid future 2008s and future Lehman Brothers moments and future Wall Street meltdowns, we should really be focused on how do we get to much better balanced trade. And P.S., if you don't like Trump's formula, seemingly, of using U.S. leverage more effectively, what is your substitute?
And, many conventional reads on this situation, and Alan Tonelson knows this better than anyone else, suggest that all of this talk is going to result in some kind of disastrous trade war. What do you say, Alan?
I say essentially what I said in that New York Times article that I published, I believe it was March 2nd, and that is that just as no business with even minimal smarts would ever declare war on its best customer, no national government, no foreign government with minimal smarts would ever declare war on the United States, because the United States invariably is its best customer.
Okay, now, is this all beginning to seep in? I'm reading about the G20 that just occurred, and they're dropping this anti-protectionist pledge. Tell us what this signals, if anything, in this evolution of a new approach to trade.
I actually think that its main importance has been, at least thus far, has been to debunk the numerous press stories that I'm sure we've all read, to the extent that a near civil war has broken out in the Trump administration between the president's more populist advisors who have been pushing a much tougher line on trade than has been taken so far.
And the Wall Street types.
Right, versus the Wall Street crowd, the former Goldman Sachs executives who occupy positions like head of the National Economic Council, Treasury Secretary, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of them. There's no doubt about that. And certainly they come from a world where free trade, quote unquote, has been highly valued despite or perhaps because of the great damage it's done to the real American economy. We could very actively debate that point, but it would certainly look like all of the pieces have been in place for that tremendous conflict over trade. And yet what we saw at that G20 meeting that took place this last weekend, and the G20, which stands for a group of 20, essentially consists of the world's 20 largest economies. Their finance ministers and also central bankers met over this weekend in Germany, largely in preparation for a G20 summit, which will involve heads of state, which will happen a little ways down the road. And and usually what happens at the end of these G20 meetings is that who's ever meeting comes out with a statement that reflects the consensus of all national governments involved as to what are the leading problems that are currently facing the global economy, and how do we best deal with them. Now, to be sure, these statements are also really are generally very vague. That's usually the price that you pay to achieve consensus. Mm-hmm. But usually, in fact, until this past weekend, they have always included some boilerplate type statement that, well, of course, we all resolve to fight any signs of rising protectionism. Now, keep in mind again, the Trump administration's representative to this G20 meeting was Treasury Secretary and former Goldman Sachs Steve Mnuchin. Mm-hmm. Obviously, or ostensibly a member of that Wall Street crowd that was very pro-free trade. Well, despite tremendous pressure from his G20 colleagues, Secretary Mnuchin decided, no, we're not going to accept yet another G20 statement with yet another meaningless promise to fight the rise of global protectionism, because P.S. most of the G20 are highly protectionist countries.
Now, let me ask you, though, a lot of these countries have signed on to various types of trade deals over the years. So is their form of protectionism more about trying to get away with not complying with various deals, or are they using different techniques like currency manipulation to make the deals sweeter for them? I mean, what is it that has made these deals, on the whole, I would imagine to some extent negotiated by people in good faith, so wrong-headed for the United States?
The fundamental problem has been that the main types of trade barriers that are left throughout the global economy are generally not the kinds of trade barriers that are easily identified. That is to say, the more traditional trade barriers, tariffs, which is to say levies on foreign goods coming in to any national market, or perhaps quotas, that is to say actual quantitative limits on how much of a certain good or service.
Okay, so there's not that many of those left.
Right, and their rates are relatively low now. That's not always the case, but generally speaking, relatively low. In their place, however, have emerged all manner of what trade mavens call non-tariff barriers. And what non-tariff barriers consist of is a wide variety, an almost mind-boggling variety, of national rules and regulations that on their surface are not intended to affect trade flows, much less limit trade flows, but in practice do. For example, health and safety regulations that have nothing to do with health and safety, but that are implied in very discriminatory ways against foreign products. Or perhaps subsidies that foreign governments provide to state-owned companies, that is to say companies that they actually control, that are very difficult to identify, again, much less regulate.
But make them a lot more competitive.
Right, because their levels aren't published. So it's basically free capital. It's free money.
I understand. And you have a really interesting theory that institutionally weak countries, like our own Mexico as our bordering state, and totalitarian countries like China, that they have really significant political reasons to want to access our markets. Explain that.
Oh, sure. Well, if I could just finish that previous point, trade barriers that are difficult to identify are even more difficult to litigate against, which is what you do under these various trade agreements that we've signed and under World Trade Organization rules. You're supposed to bring the equivalent of a lawsuit, which means that you've got to present evidence, and that evidence is excruciatingly difficult to find, and the main reason is that most of the foreign governments that we trade with are very secretive. They believe that knowledge is power, and one of their top priorities is making sure that foreign interests don't get that knowledge. So again, we are often left playing this mug's game of filing lawsuits in various world trade courts that we can't possibly win because we can't get any evidence.
Okay, so how do they hold on to the power that they have amassed in these secretive and these very controlling ways by having access to the freest market in the world? What does that ensure them, or what does that ward off in terms of their losing their influence and power, some of these leaders in China? for example?
When we're talking about countries like Mexico and like China, where even if the actual governments are not weak, certainly there's nothing like American-style political institutions that have historically, anyway, done a very good job of ensuring stability over long stretches of time. And as a result, and this is especially the case for China, the government's legitimacy depends on its ability to deliver the economic goods to the Chinese people, to deliver enough of them, and to deliver them well enough to make sure that the Chinese people are willing to accept a degree of political repression that we would never accept here. The price of their silence is the kinds of living standards that most Chinese have never experienced and are in fact quite happy with. So if China stops becoming more prosperous because its access to America's trade markets is at least, sharply limited, if not cut off altogether, the fate of the Chinese leadership becomes very questionable.
Very interesting. Now, is that how you would put trade policy in the context of a nation's foreign policy overall? I mean, when you try to balance the two and how intricately they are linked, again, put it in context for us.
That's also a great question because throughout the post-World War II period, Washington has acted as if it does face major trade-offs between trade policy goals and foreign policy goals. Now, before 1990, that crucial date that we talked about previously, before 1990, which was essentially the era of the Cold War that pit the U.S. against the communist world and principally the Soviet Union, during that Cold War period, the trade-off was almost always resolved in favor of national security goals, meaning that Washington developed the habit of giving away big chunks of the U.S. market to foreign competition in order to make sure that foreign governments either remained friendly to us and remained helpful to us or became friendly to us and became helpful to us in that global struggle against Soviet power. After the Cold War ended, that foreign policy rationale for these kinds of trade policy decisions obviously became much weaker, but to an absolutely astonishing extent, they remained in place because, as it turned out, one of Washington's major goals regarding alleged allies like Japan and like Germany was to make sure that they never reverted into the World War II versions of themselves. And that meant, once again, trying to keep them pacified by giving them much more access to the American market than American producers and their workers had to their markets. Now, one of the hallmarks of the Trump administration's foreign policy rhetoric so far has been that these trade-offs are going to be handled in a very different way, and that trade policy concerns and broader economic concerns are going to be accorded a much higher priority. I think that's great news if they follow through.
Now, some people say, as we're looking forward on America Trends, and by the way, folks, we'll give you all of the contact information if you want to talk to Alan Tonelson, you want to communicate with him, you want to read all of his material going forward about trade, which is such an important issue these days. Some people say, Alan, that the horse has left the barn, that even if we reverse all of these recent trends, it won't mean new jobs because automation will negate any of the gains that have been made in bringing manufacturing jobs back. What do you say?
I'd say that those people don't seem to understand that even when you're talking about high-value U.S. manufacturing, advanced U.S. manufacturing, the kinds of manufacturing industries in which high-income, technologically proficient countries like the United States should be incredibly competitive, and which allegedly, again, are becoming automated faster and faster and faster, there are still roughly 3 million American workers who earn very good wages. And those jobs are not going to be automated out of existence right away, or frankly anytime soon. Of course, their numbers will go down, but I would expect it's going to be much more gradual than widely predicted. And so therefore, it is absolutely essential that U.S. trade policy do a much better job of making sure that whatever competition those high-value American industries face is actually equitable competition that they can hope to win. Currently, in too many instances, that's not the case. The second point that these trade policy pessimists, let's call them that, always overlook is that it's quite possible that the rate of automation is not nearly as great as is commonly described in our newspapers and on TV shows, etc. And the reason I say that is because when you look at the actual U.S. government data on what's called productivity, which is a measure of economic efficiency, that gives us a pretty good idea of the extent to which companies are introducing labor-saving technologies into their factories. American productivity growth has been almost nil.
I saw that. Very
for
sluggish.
many years now. Now, there's no question that productivity is one of the most mysterious phenomenon that economists study. Most intellectually honest ones will recognize that. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. But there is certainly no evidence that the pace of U.S. productivity growth, which would tell us a lot about, again, the rate at which American companies are introducing labor-saving technologies, there is absolutely no evidence that that's going faster, and yet U.S. manufacturing still keeps losing jobs.
Yeah, very interesting.
Even advanced manufacturing.
Of all the levers that we have going forward, new trade deals, we're getting out of the TPP, we want to renegotiate deals we have, we're hearing about new tax policy, which some say can really do a lot of what we need to do to make our companies more competitive and encourage them to stay here, and maybe even taking back some of the money that they have left parked overseas, an educated workforce. When you look at all the levers that we have available to us, which ones are most significant and will have the greatest impact on American jobs going forward?
That tax reform proposal that you mentioned could indeed be an incredibly powerful device for rebalancing U.S. trade flows, because without getting too technical, and boy, does this get technical, let me tell you, without getting too technical, it would change the American corporate taxation system in ways that would give American exports a subsidy, and that would impose a tax on all American imports. And that could be a game changer, because it looks like that subsidy and that tax would be in the neighborhood of about 20%. And as the current occupant of the White House, at least on weeknights, likes to say, that could be huge.
All right. Now, a new America with new trade policies, new tax policies, what does that do to refit the entire global economy? What does that mean going forward?
It could well mean that, and again, crucial question, Larry, and I'm very glad that you brought it up. It could well mean, at least in the short term, slower growth for much of the rest of the world, because as we said earlier, much of the rest of the world has depended very heavily for its growth on exporting much more than is actually imported, and so many of those exports have been targeted at this country. So if foreign countries' access to the U.S. market is limited and in fact cut, then they're going to have to find substitute engines of growth. And that is not going to be easy at all. But what we have to keep in mind is that could very well be the price that the entire world pays for a more stable global economy, one that doesn't simply lurch from bubble to crisis to bubble again, which many very eminent economists argue is the situation we find ourselves in now, and it's a very unhealthy one, and in fact an extremely dangerous one.
Alan Tonelson, I can't thank you enough for being with us today on America Trends. How can people read all of the work that you're doing on an ongoing basis and keep up with this really important issue?
Well, thanks for this great self-promotion opportunity, Larry. My website, which is called Realitychek, and Czech is spelled C-H-E-K to be catchy, can be found at www.alantonelson.wordpress.com, and you can also get a great idea of what I'm thinking at any given moment, if you're interested in that, if you follow me on Twitter, where I tweet at @Alan Tonelson.
All right. Well, wonderful. Alan, I have been following you without Twitter for so many years, and it really has been a joy in my career as a broadcaster to be able to bring your thinking to an audience here in Connecticut and around the country now. And I'm just honored to have you as a friend and as somebody I can turn to really help me understand these issues. Thank you so much.
Well, Larry, that all goes double for me, and I am thrilled that you've decided to take your broadcasting career and your journalism career down what looks like a very exciting new road.
Well, thank you. I hope it's not a rabbit hole, but we're having a lot of fun with it.
I don't think so.
I know.
Sure.
Alan, we will talk with you again real soon. Thank you.
I hope so, and thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Larry.
If you like this episode of America Trends Podcast, will you please leave us a kind rating or a review on iTunes? John, is that too much to ask?
No, or even a comment. Give us in the
Anything.
comment section on the ones that you liked. And, you can also email me at newsletter@rifkinradio.com. And that's another way you can contact us with your ideas.
Don't forget, your review really is important to us. And, John, they may say, why? Why? Why is it so important? Well, the more
why?
You're even asking that.
Why?
Well, the more you like us, the better placement we get, which then helps us improve our rankings and visibility so that more people can enjoy us. And the more people, John, you see how this is spiraling?
It's getting out of control there.
The more people who know about us and like our content, the greater chance we have to encourage advertisers to hop aboard. You see how it works now, John?
I understand now. That's very interesting.
And we don't want these folks who are listening to miss a single episode of America Trends Podcast. I mean, we're recording tons of them, aren't we?
No, and they're all very interesting, and we got some really good stuff coming up.
Oh, we really do. But we want you to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher.com. And when you do subscribe, let us know on Facebook and Twitter. Our handle on both platforms is @TrendsPodcast. We want to thank you personally for subscribing. In fact, John may have a very beautiful thank you gift. John, what is it? No? We ran out of them?
All out of gifts.
Oh, my goodness. Well,
Sorry
please,
about that.
please send us your ideas and questions for future episodes and topics on America Trends Podcast. We can't think of them all, right, John?
That's right.
I mean, my head's already exploding.
Oh, yes.
You see it.
I
Cloud
see it.
above. Is there an author you'd love to hear from? Or a subject you'd like to learn more about? Send us your ideas on Facebook and Twitter. And by the way, you can direct message us at Trends Podcast or use hashtag Trends Podcast. You can also add an email address if you have one that you want to give out. And we do not, right, John? We don't share our list.
No spamming, no list getting out. You just get our newsletter.
Absolutely. And you can access our full show archive on our website at americatrendspodcast.com. For more information on America Trends and for the latest updates on our upcoming episodes, be sure to like our page on Facebook and follow us on Twitter. You can find us at Trends Podcast. Oh, by the way, and John, this is really important, and you know.
What is it? What is it?
Well, if you buy from Amazon, we have joined their Associates program. So you go to americatrendspodcast.com before you purchase, and you click over to Amazon from our Amazon store.
That's a very good point, because it doesn't cost them any more money to do that.
No, that's all built in.
And then we get a few pesos.
Yeah,
It helps
but
keep
and
the
look,
podcast going.
if we get a small VIG, 2 or 3%, if you don't do it through us, you're just giving more money to Jeff Bezos.
Exactly.
And he doesn't need any more money.
He doesn't need it.
And he doesn't do any podcasts, I don't think. So please, with no added cost to you, it helps us to bring you the content that you're enjoying. And thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Please keep listening.